In the time when man was connected to nature, you might want to look at it this way, that man's face was reflected back to him directly in nature. Nature was man and man was nature. He was one. He was connected. When the ego came about, it's almost like the projection of man's own visage in nature faded. In other words, nature dropped man's image because man was no longer there. It's literally man had ceased to exist. He's a simulacra of what man really was. Now when man is in the subjective state, he hungrily and desperately, especially since the age of trauma when the ego was born, it looked back into nature to find its face there and didn't find it. Not realizing that ego is the cause. And ever since, man has been looking to find its face in nature. Not being able to find his face in nature, he became even more disturbed, and his antipathy towards nature increased. Technology.
Is that you think when we start to kind of, how should we put it, project our image onto it, meaning that we anthropomorphize things, we put a smiley face on the sun, etc.? That's
it. Anthropomorphism is the dire consequence of a lot of historical philosophy and technology. It's even haunted many decent forms of eco-philosophy and so on and so forth. And man, through his technology, one aspect of his technology is that he is now desperately trying to embed his own face again where it is no longer there.
Right. Just explain what you mean by eco. What do you say? Eco.
Well, the eco-philosophers, like the deep ecology movement and.
Right. Like, for instance, we identify with the polar bear, so that becomes the symbol of the climatic change movement. Is that what you're talking about?
No, not necessarily. I'm speaking about certain schools that are like neo-pagan, or they do want a much more holistic. They do realize that God is nature, nature is God.
Mm-hmm.
And they preach this: that let's get out of civilizations. The sort of anarchistic model.
Okay, I see what you mean. Okay, yeah.
They're good, I believe. I'm very much in favor of some of what these guys are doing. But some of them have this anthropomorphic, romantic idea, you see. And that's, again, an inauthentic way of seeing human beings there. It's not altogether negative. I mean, William Wordsworth, if you read his poetry, he's right on the ball, and many of them, other ones were as well. And, of course, Rainier Mary Rilke and others who've done this, and Holderlin. There's so much beauty in the poetry that do talk about this, because they're not victims of the technological mindset, of course. The poets are, by definition, even Heidegger agreed, the ones who are back in a natural rapport with the natural. But when you're not, you then, through technology, force your footprint onto nature. Mm. And this is what then is happening now with all of these colonializations and colonizations of indigenous peoples, and making them modern and contaminating them, and putting Coca-Cola ad billboards in the jungle and projections and all the rest of it. All of this is born out of this idea to again find man's visage, but not in a holistic way. Once upon a time, man looked into nature and saw himself. Now he wants to do it again, but in an artificial way. This is very, very deadly.
What do you make of all because that seems to be, I guess, an incentive or an idea right now as well, is that the world is also slowly kind of turning towards very much of the anti-consumerism. The world is turning away from, let's, just as you mentioned that the Coca-Cola sign in the jungle, that is frowned upon now in one way, and that's also going out the door. Where do you see, does that stem from a true, point of view, do you think, or do you see some danger with the anti-consumerism, anti-industrialization that's going on now as well, Michael?
Well, I see it as pretty much positive if man can get back to some of these, existential philosophical points. And don't forget that it doesn't mean that technology doesn't have a role in the lives of awakened people. And of course, didn't even the shamanic people have to use horses?
Yeah, sure, of course.
And it's just technology.
Technology is even the use of entheogenic substance, for instance. That's a form of technology too, or fire, or whatever, what have you.
Making a fishing net to catch fish.
Sure, exactly.
Yeah. So it's not technology is wrong in itself. It's what it's being used for and how it's being used for. If it's being used so that the ego can gain a certain suzerainty that once upon a time the whole self had, well, then we're in deep trouble. But if the technology can aid and abet man to do this thinking process and link him back to nature as it really is, then by all means that is very, very positive. Mm. So the technology is ambivalent itself. It can be used for different purposes, you see.
Do you want to talk a little bit more about basically the Cartesian worldview and the Descartes and so forth?
Yeah, because Descartes is one of the idealists, rationalists, whose own process of thought exemplifies the man who's haunted by the mysterium. That's why in the article I talk about Descartes as being disciple of the mysterium, taking the Heideggerian principle that all the philosophers since Plato, including Plato, were disciples of the lie, or that they had taken philosophy off in the wrong direction. And Descartes was one we assiduously studied him back in the days when I took the classes in Belfast, and therefore we were really up to speed on his teachings. And basically what Descartes had the problem was, he sat down to basically convince himself that he existed. And his process was what we know today to be skepticism, that he would doubt everything about himself and everything about the world. He would subject all of that to rigorous doubt. And it's what later became known as the skeptical school. And his process, after a long period of time, he decided that he could be sure that he existed because of his capacity to doubt. If he could doubt, then he must be a thinking animal. And if he thought, it implied that there was a thinker there. And therefore, he said, cogito ergo sum, I think, therefore I am, the famous motto.
Yeah.
Then where the flaw is there is that he didn't question, if you're using thought as a proof of existence, you're assuming that your thought is wholesome and rational and perfect. But what happens if it's not? Can you still then be thought to exist if your thinking was flawed in the first place?
Very difficult question. I don't think so.
Right.
I don't think so.
Or at least by his own definition, you couldn't.
Yeah.
He might argue, no, even if my thought is deficient, I still am thinking, therefore I know I exist. But actually, if you really want to be split hairs about it, no, you can't. Because if your thinking is itself not true thought, or as if I say, thought has been perverted by the presence of the mysterium and a false sense of identity, I don't think you can use that as a justification to actually say you exist. But then Descartes moved on, because remember, in the Descartesian model, in the Cartesian model, mind, body, and world are three separate things. This is what's called Cartesian dualism that infected all the philosophers. Remember, I told you it's because of the mask that we wear. We wear the mysterium mask and we look out through different eyes, and therefore we can never resolve this dualism problem.
Yeah.
But he even said that God was separate. To all rationalists and idealists, God is a separate mysterium that is even outside the mind. So the next step for Descartes was then to say, now that I know that I exist, how can I then be sure that the objects of the world exist?
Yeah.
And and in the beginning, he was very doubtful of it. He said, I know my senses see it, but I could be deluded about it. And then after a little bit more thought, he said, oh no, I can't be deluded about it. And here's the reason. He said that I know that God created all. He created me, he created the reason, and he created the world. Remember, as we talked earlier, this is the mysterium of theologians. They do not say nature created God, created man, created mind. They claim that a concept of their own minds. Now you got to really get the logic of this, or the illogic of it. They say this is rationalism for you. A figment of my own imagination that I believe is absolutely outside of me. It's not a mental creation, even though it is. I trust that to endorse and to verify for me that I exist, and that also the world exists. Because in Descartes' model, he said that since God has created the world, God would never lie to me. God is not a deceiver. The devil is the deceiver. God would never deceive me, and therefore I can be sure that the world as I see it exists because God would never lie to me. And on paper, this sounded wonderful, and it started an entire school of philosophy.
So it goes back to belief again. It's all about belief. You can't prove anything.
Right, because as we said earlier on, the thoughts of man are not nature created. They're mind created. And you can twist it in whatever way you want. In other words, but it's even something more sinister is happening there in the Cartesian model. Why did Descartes, by the same token, and as a philosopher, not say, now that I know that I think, I can be sure that the world exists. I go to my own proof for the world existing. I know that it existed because I exist. He goes to a mysterium and says, I trust the mysterium, which is the perverse creation of my own mind, and use that as the prima facie evidence that the world exists. Do you see how convoluted this becomes?
Yeah.
Maybe even if he had come from an existentialist point of view and go, look, I just trust that the world exists because I know I do, maybe he would have been onto something there. But he didn't.
Could it be that he, lived in a time, because I can't recall this now, what era I lived in, could the church still be involved here in some way, meaning that he incorporated this into his worldview in order to not be, hanged or something for being a heretic?
Well, this is what we were taught. It's true. That's what Alan, my philosophy teacher, insisted, that Descartes wanted to save himself from being thrown into a dungeon, and therefore had an elaborate propaganda campaign to make his own philosophy look Christianized.
Yeah.
because he would have been dragged out and hung, really tortured. So yes, that's part of it. But nevertheless, since that we can't be 100% sure of that, we have to go by his own philosophy. We can't think about these possible what would you
Outcomes
call it?
or versions of what he did. Yeah, sure.
Yeah, they're speculative, you see. All we can know is what the man wrote down. And as far as he's concerned, his philosophy said that God, that is not me. God is outside nature. God is the prime mover. He is not going to deceive me, so I can trust. But when we look at that from an existential point of view, it has no validity. And therefore, all forms of rationalism and idealism that arose, even the Hegelian forms and all of this, are made null and void. And in fact, they were already made null and void under their own weight. By the time of Immanuel Kant, the entire rationalistic ship had ground to a complete halt, and along came Kant to try and resolve those issues. And that itself is a very fascinating story, which we don't have time to get into.